After the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, one of the most urgent and complicated questions for the Allies was what to do with the enormous stockpile of German military equipment. At the time of surrender, the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine had amassed millions of weapons, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. These machines of war had helped Germany terrorize Europe for 6 years. And now, in the aftermath, the victors had to decide what should become of them. The fate of these weapons wasn't just about logistics. It was about power, punishment, secrecy, and the future of warfare itself. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from the west and the Soviet Union from the east, they encountered depots, airfields, bunkers, and armories filled with weapons. In many cases, retreating German units had already destroyed or sabotaged their own equipment to keep it out of enemy hands. However, much was left intact, especially in areas where German commanders chose to surrender quickly or in territories overrun too fast for demolition. The result was a massive, chaotic spread of German military gear falling into Allied hands all at once. And the question was, who would get what? The immediate priority for the Allies was disarmament. In the months following Germany's surrender, occupying forces systematically collected and catalogued German weapons. German soldiers were ordered to stack their rifles, remove tank turrets, and abandon heavy artillery. Entire columns of panzer tanks were driven to open fields and left under guard. The Allies feared a Nazi guerrilla resistance movement, sometimes called the Werwolf Plan, and so they didn't want any chance of rearmament. Most small arms, rifles, pistols, machine guns, were gathered and either melted down or dumped into the sea. Mountains of Mauser rifles and Luger pistols, once coveted by Allied soldiers as war trophies, were either destroyed en masse or distributed to friendly regimes or internal police forces. Tons of ammunition were burned or buried. The destruction of these weapons wasn't always efficient. Some were piled up and burned, leading to dangerous explosions. Others were dumped into rivers or oceans, including the Baltic Sea, causing long-term environmental damage. Tanks presented a bigger problem. Germany had produced nearly 50,000 tanks and assault guns during the war, including iconic machines like the Tiger, Panther, and Panzer IV. These tanks were engineering marvels, feared on the battlefield, and many were still operational at war's end. The Soviets and Americans were particularly interested in the Panther and Tiger tanks, not just as trophies, but as blueprints for future design. Despite being complicated and prone to mechanical issues, the sheer power of these tanks impressed Allied commanders. As such, some were carefully recovered, studied, and even used in post-war military exercises. In fact, both the US and the Soviet Union took large numbers of captured German tanks back to their homelands for analysis. The Soviets, in particular, were fascinated by the German optics and armor technology. Soviet engineers disassembled Tiger and Panther tanks to learn more about their guns, transmission systems, and composite armor. This influenced later Soviet tank designs, particularly the T-54 and T-62. The Americans, too, brought home German vehicles to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where they were tested and examined. Some German tanks were even displayed in museums and used in films, becoming symbols of both Nazi aggression and wartime ingenuity. However, most German tanks were not preserved. Many were driven into scrap yards and cut apart for raw materials. In the ruined cities of post-war Germany, steel was precious. Entire panzer divisions were chopped up and repurposed into beams, girders, and rebar for reconstruction. Some tanks were used for target practice by the Allies. They were towed into remote fields, marked as enemy vehicles, and destroyed in live-fire drills. Others were simply abandoned in forests or buried where they stood, too expensive to move or too dangerous due to unexploded ordnance. The Allies also found a staggering number of aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the most powerful air force in Europe, left behind thousands of planes, many of which were cutting-edge or experimental. Jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 had stunned Allied pilots during the war. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter, and it was years ahead of anything the Allies had in the sky. At the end of the war, dozens of these planes were found in hangars, runways, and even camouflaged in forests. The US and the UK immediately began capturing these planes for study. Under Operation Lusty, American intelligence agents and engineers swept through Germany to find and secure advanced Luftwaffe technology before the Soviets could get it. Entire squadrons of Me-262s, Arado jet bombers, and experimental flying wing aircraft were crated up and shipped back to the United States. These aircraft played a key role in the development of early Cold War aviation, helping to shape U.S. jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre. Similarly, Nazi missile and rocket technology was scooped up by the Allies in a race against time. The German V-2 rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, had terrorized London and Antwerp in the final year of the war. After the surrender, both the US and the Soviet Union scrambled to find V-2 launch sites, factories, and surviving rockets. Under Operation Paperclip, the US smuggled dozens of German scientists, including von Braun himself, into America to work on the US space and missile programs. Much of America's early rocketry, including the Saturn V that launched Apollo 11, can trace its lineage to German wartime technology. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union wasn't far behind. Soviet teams also recovered V-2 hardware and documentation, along with engineers who were either recruited or coerced into working in the Soviet missile program. In many ways, the Cold War space race was born from the ashes of Nazi Germany's weapons programs. Naval equipment faced a similar fate. The Kriegsmarine had fewer assets than the German Army or Air Force, but it still boasted a sizable fleet of submarines, destroyers, and a few capital ships. At the end of the war, over 150 U-boats were still intact. Many of these submarines were scuttled by their own crews as part of Operation Regenbogen to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Others were captured in dry docks or surrendered at sea. The Allies, again, saw technological potential. The most famous German submarine of the time, the Type 21 U-boat, was a revolutionary design. It could operate underwater for extended periods thanks to advanced battery systems and streamlined hull design. The Allies had no equivalent. As a result, captured Type 21 submarines were studied in detail. The U.S. Navy's GUPPY program, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, was directly influenced by German submarine technology. The British and Soviets also incorporated lessons from German subs into their own fleets. A few German U-boats were even kept in service for years after the war, under new flags. Eventually, the remaining U-boats were either dismantled or destroyed. In 1945 and 1946, a multinational operation called Operation Deadlight was launched to scuttle surplus German submarines in the North Atlantic. Over 100 submarines were towed out to sea and sunk deliberately. Some sank during towing due to bad weather. Others were blown up by naval gunfire or torpedoed as part of practice drills. Today, many of these wrecks still rest on the ocean floor, slowly rusting away. Back in Germany, the occupying powers began transforming the nation from a militarized war machine into a subdued, demilitarized state. This involved more than just collecting weapons. Entire industries were dismantled or repurposed. German arms factories were shuttered or retooled for civilian production. The Allies wanted to ensure that Germany could never again wage a war of conquest. In the Western zones, this policy was eventually relaxed as the Cold War intensified, but in the immediate post-war years, it was strict. At the same time, some German weapons were reissued to new regimes. France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia used German tanks and small arms in their post-war militaries. In some cases, ex-Wehrmacht equipment was the only gear available. The French Foreign Legion, for example, used German half-tracks and rifles in its wars in Indochina and Algeria. In Eastern Europe, the Soviets distributed captured German equipment to their satellite states and used it in propaganda to demonstrate the superiority of the communist bloc over fascism. Surprisingly, a black market also emerged. Weapons that had been lost during Allied collection operations were sometimes sold off, hidden in barns, or even kept as souvenirs. Luger pistols and SS daggers became prized among collectors. In some parts of Europe, especially rural areas, it was not uncommon to find German helmets, machine guns, or ammunition stashed away for decades. Even today, farmers occasionally uncover rusted rifles or grenades buried since 1945. Over the following decades, many remaining pieces of German military equipment became museum exhibits. Tanks and planes were restored and displayed in military museums across the world. Others were used in films, especially those portraying World War II. Some countries, particularly Israel and Yugoslavia, used modified German equipment into the 1950s and beyond. The legacy of German military engineering, both admired and feared, continued long after the war had ended. In the end, the weapons and tanks of Nazi Germany met varied fates. Some were destroyed, others repurposed, and many studied for the next generation of warfare. What began as a global effort to disarm a defeated enemy became the foundation for the next era of military technology. The Cold War arms race, the space race, and even modern armored warfare owe a significant debt to the twisted legacy of Germany's wartime innovations. What was once a symbol of terror became, piece by piece, the building blocks of a new world order.